Hi everyone and welcome to this week's EBC video. We're in Savage, Minnesota at Savage's Community Gardens this week. Now we're going to be using these community gardens to be thinking about John 15 verses 1 through 8, right? When you have a community garden, you go there, you actually get a little plot of land, you're growing some things, sometimes, not this particular one, but sometimes then that gets shared directly with the public at the same time. We've actually got one at St. John's where we grow things and the youth grow them and then actually help out some of the food shelves in the area. It's really a fantastic service. Now, but we're going to be using these to be thinking about what Jesus is talking about in John 15, and he starts this by talking about him as the vine. Jesus is the vine, and then God is the vine grower. And I gotta say, I looked at these verses for quite a while, and you know, oftentimes Jesus uses these allegories or parables, and it's to make things clearer. This one didn't jump out at me as the clearest possible thing, right? So Jesus is talking about him as the vine, and then he talks about us as the branches. Now, what does it mean to be a branch when Jesus is the vine? So we're connected to him. We're doing things with his help, right? Jesus talks about the fact that if you're a branch, you can't do anything unless you're connected to that vine. So let's just take that pumpkin vine that might be growing back here in a couple of months, right? If that vine's growing and then you're gonna stretch out and have a branch off of it that maybe a pumpkin's gonna be on the end of, none of that works unless you're still connected to Jesus. And so that's the first thing that he's talking about, staying connected to him, living in him. All right, and then he says it's important to bear fruit. All right, so what does it mean for us to bear fruit? All right, one way to be thinking about that is just to be living in his word, but another way to be thinking about it is all the good deeds that we do, all the things that we can do for other people. That might be bearing fruit, or even just studying his word, or telling other people about God. All of those things would be bearing fruit. But Jesus says that it is our job to bear that fruit, and that if we don't bear fruit, then that little branch gets pruned, right? So now we're thinking about that from the standpoint of needing to do things. And I'm gonna get back to that in a moment, whether the fact is that we need to do things or whether the answer is that we're going to want to do things, right? So we've got those two aspects of the story, right? Then Jesus says something that's really interesting. He says, if you abide in me and my word abides in you, he says, ask for anything you want, it'll be given to you. I just wait. I'm just pausing at this point here. Like, wait, that can't mean what it sounds like, right? If we live in Jesus, we can ask for anything, and it's ours. But here's where it starts to become really key that we're listening to the whole story all together, because what Jesus says is that if you abide in me, if you live and accept Jesus, and my word abides in you, his word is in us. That kind of means that we're not going to be asking for and wishing for things other than what God has in mind for us. So thinking about it from that standpoint, what Jesus is saying is if we're doing what Jesus has for us as a purpose, God's there to help us. And when we ask for things, he's going to give them to us. Okay? Now, after verse 8, verse 8 ends what we're talking about today. But in verse 10, we've got one more really neat statement here, right? About if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. Just as I kept God's commandments and I abide in his love. And if you think about that for a moment, it's just a really important aspect of this story that we're not earning anything here. It doesn't say, if you keep my commandments, you will have earned any salvation. What it says is keeping my commandments demonstrates, shows the world that you love me. And there's this really neat phrase back in verse 8 about the fact that when we abide in God, when we do the things that God wants us to do, we glorify God. That's one more aspect of this community garden that we can think about for a moment, right? That it's not just the garden that's at our little homes here, but it's the garden for the community. It's about sharing this with other people. And it's really amazing, think about this for a moment, that what happens is when we do great things, we glorify God. God is amazing. God is fantastic. And yet Jesus is assuring us that when we live in him, when we bear that fruit, it's helping demonstrate to other people how fantastic and amazing God is. So everyone, have a great week going and finding a way to glorify God.